Proximity is the distance between every visual element on the screen. We use it to signal relationships between those elements. Do you see a trend here? We keep talking about relationships. We keep talking about how elements work together to create a cohesive whole, or to create an experience, or to move people through content. All right? Relationships, relationships, relationships. That is what user interface design is about. Creating relationships, establishing meaning. Elements that are visually close to each other are perceived as a single group. They're related by context of use. So if we see circles that are grouped like this, they're all visually close to each other. The amount of negative space between them is exactly the same. Their proximity to one another, in other words, is exactly the same. Unrelated items, on the other hand, are visually separated. They're far from each other. Like this. If we put a circle way out here on the right, or another one way out here on the left, or another one in the center, or another one down here towards the bottom, or another one way down on the bottom cut off, these are visually separated, not only from each other, but from the other grouping that we already have on the screen. That says these are unrelated to those other things. They're not related in context to each other. They're not talking about the same thing. They don't do the same thing. They don't take you to the same place, right? Or they don't show you the same kind of content. So we've got a group and we've got a bunch of unrelated elements, both to that group and to each other. The job of proximity, as we said, is to describe relationships. This is perceived as one group, okay? All components are related to each other. Similar shape, similar size, similar proximity. Negative space is consistent all the way through. As opposed to this is perceived as two groups where each set is different from the other. That giant gap between the two sets, that's a difference in proximity. That difference in proximity says these are not related. Now I want to show you something else. Proximity often beats color and contrast in terms of dominance, in terms of importance, in terms of establishing hierarchy. Okay, and here's how. These two groups are separated further by color and contrast. We got one set on the left that's darker, all right, a lot more contrast than the set on the right. But here's what I want you to notice. Even if we vary the items with more contrast, even if each group contains a few items that have more contrast than the others, proximity is still signaling these are two different groups. So the color differences, the contrast differences here don't matter. We are still reading this as two groups. Now, what this may communicate is these darker items are somehow of more importance than their peers, all right, than their friends. But overall, it still holds together as two groups, even though we've changed contrast. We use proximity to create context. I showed you this layout a minute ago, right? The difference between where it was and what we changed. We changed alignment, but we also changed the negative space between elements. The negative space here on the left, on the initial layout, is pretty much non-existent. All this stuff reads as a big chunk of information with a few holes here and there, okay, between it. And I'm oversimplifying to make the point. On the right, you can see that the increase in negative space starts to separate things, okay? We start to see individual elements as groups, as items that do different things, that signify different things, that take us to different places. That difference in proximity, those differences in proximity, create the context. What this is, what it does, how it's related or unrelated to everything else around it. So we use proximity to group or separate related visual elements. Doing so creates clarity. Again, if we look at that old layout and we abstract it, we get something that looks like this. It all blends together. We see it all at the same time. When we increase proximity and use it appropriately, okay, to either group or separate things, instead of the eye seeing this jumbled mess, it sees this. All right, we see the individual elements. We're able to clearly separate one from the other, which also means we can scan and bounce through this a hell of a lot more quickly because it's all separated. Because the things that are related to each other are really close together and the things that are unrelated are far apart.